Okay, so I'm very quickly just going to go through some of the history of interactive fiction. The two forms that I came across in my teens were those of books and computer programs, and we're going to take a look at the books first. There's an American writer called Edward Packard who first coined the phrase choose your own adventures in the 1970s. He came up with the idea of the books when he was making up bedtime stories for his kids. He used to let them decide which endings they wanted, and then he'd make up the endings that they based on what they wanted, basically. His books were written in second person and in present tense, with sentences like, "You are standing on a glacier staring down into the crevasse." At the bottom of some of the pages you were given a choice of what actions you'd like to take, and next to each action there was a page number that you could turn to. Packard's books were the original and probably the simplest of this style of books, but loads of authors began writing similar books, and if you look at the fighting fantasy series by the British writers Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, they took the idea of a book where you could choose your own path and made it more like a role-playing game, or RPG, similar in some ways to games like Dungeons and Dragons. So instead of just choosing which page to turn to, you also kept a score sheet. And at the beginning of the book you'd roll dice to determine things like your skill levels, stamina and luck, and things like how many gold coins you start off with. Then during the book, if you had to fight a monster or solve a problem, you'd combine the levels that you had on your score sheet with more dice rolls to decide whether you were successful or not. And you could also obviously collect and spend the gold coins. So dozens of different authors wrote these kinds of books, and they became known as single-player role-playing game books. So there was no definite pattern of how the books were written in terms of how many endings there should be and how many of the endings were positive or negative. There were massive differences between the books. Some were really difficult to get to a positive ending, with dozens of ways to fail or die. Steve Jackson said he believed fighting fantasy books were so popular because they were difficult, and you'd have to read them quite a few times in order to win. There was at least one choose your own adventure book that I read where you could never die, and eventually no matter which route you took you got to the one ending. There were some other ideas too. There was a series called Be an Interplanetary Spy, where alongside choices you had to solve puzzles, and depending on which answer you decided was correct you turned to that page. And obviously if you got it wrong your spaceship would collide with an asteroid or find some other sticky end. So there were quite a few different styles of these books, but virtually all of them were written in second person present tense, and the vast majority of them were aimed at children and teens, and probably teen boys rather more than teen girls. So the other thing we'll look at is text adventure games on computers. There were a few basic games made on computers in the 60s and early 70s, but the first text adventure game as such was Colossal Cave Adventure, which was developed I think from 1975 to 1977, and that was built to run on a mainframe computer. I think it was shortly after that, in around 77, when Zork was released, which was originally built for mainframe but was later released for home computers. Zork is probably the most famous of all the early adventure games, and you can still play it online in close to its original format if you search around for it. It was basically an underground kingdom which you find through a trapdoor in a house. Just like the choose your own adventure books, all the early adventure games were written in second person in present tense, but unlike the books you weren't given explicit choices to choose from. You'd be told what was in the room you're in and what exits there were, but then it was up to you to decide what commands to type. So yeah, some of the most common commands were things like go south, go west, go up the stairs, pick up the sword, eat the food, kill the monster, those kind of things. The game would basically look for keywords in your typed sentence and compare them to a list or to listed actions that are allowed, and then the game would hopefully do what you wanted, or otherwise reply something like you can't do that or I don't understand. Most of the earlier games were quest based, where you went exploring or went on some kind of adventure, so they didn't really have a linear storyline where there was a main drag or main plot line of the story to follow. There may have been various goals or things you could achieve, but rather than a storyline as such, the game would have the game was map based. So the game designers would have created maps made up of squares, and as a user you could go backwards and forwards as many times as you liked between the various squares. For example, going north to one square, then back south to the square you just left. So most adventure games were this kind of style, but there were also quite a few strategy games where you might be ruling a country, or you were a gangster boss or a football manager, and you had to make decisions on how you would deal with different situations that arose. I don't know if these were strictly called text adventures, but they were a similar idea. But instead of moving around a map, you made decisions on different events that were happening. So, should you invest more in agriculture to feed the population, or should you invest more in the army to protect it from its aggressive neighbour? And the game behind the scenes would compare the amount of money or the figures that you came up with to arbitrary numbers that the game designers had set. And if you spent enough in each area, you had a successful year and the population loved you. And if you chose the wrong amounts, the country was invaded by its neighbour, or the population of the country would rise up against you and depose you as leader. Okay, so what is the current position with interactive fiction? And I use the phrase interactive fiction, but there are loads of different phrases meaning similar or overlapping things. You've got interactive fiction, or IF. You've got things like choose your own adventure, which is CYOA, you sometimes see it written. Choose your own path, narrative games, gamebooks, role-playing games or RPG, text adventures, adventure games, you-decide stories, and loads of other phrases that all overlap to some extent. I'm sure there's many people in gaming who can tell you the exact difference between them all. But choose your own adventure, by the way, is a trademarked phrase, which is why people quite often use other phrases to describe their work, like choose your own path. In fact, the TV series Black Mirror released a one-off video on Netflix called Bandersnatch, where you can make different choices in the video. And because they used the phrase choose your own adventure, Netflix ended up getting sued by the trademark owner. Anyway, so you can still access some of the original gamebooks and still find and play some of the original text adventure games online. Some geeky people who no doubt grew up in the 70s and 80s have even recreated the operating systems, so you can play the original text adventure games on a blocky black and white interface and imagine you're back in your childhood. But I imagine that's fairly niche. The gamebooks also seem to have lost quite a lot of their popularity. You can still find a few of them on Amazon, but nowhere near as many as I'd expected to find. Although gamebooks like the Fighting Fantasy series have been picked up by a narrative game company called Tin Man Games, so you can actually still read the adventures online, but in their original format, I think both the books and the original text adventures have become fairly niche. But on the other hand, interactive fiction, I think, seems to be seeing a bit of a resurgence, particularly on mobile apps and smart speakers. There are also some interactive fiction titles available for desktop, which have 3D environments and visuals, but they still use the basic concepts of a text adventure. So the two areas we'd probably be most interested in writing for are for mobile apps, which could be text adventures with or without visuals and sound, or audio adventures. And the other one obviously is smart speakers, which will be primarily aimed at audio and speech, but which might still have some visual and text elements for those people accessing them on smartphones or smart speakers with built-in screens, like a Google Home Hub. So we'll take a brief look at both mobile apps and smart speakers, how they work and what's currently available. Okay, so there are quite a number of text adventure mobile apps that can be downloaded. Some of these are written in second person again, similar to the Choose Your Own Adventure books, although there are some written with the main character in first person or third person, but where you still make the decisions. Most of those I've looked at seem to have a main storyline where, although you make decisions along the way, you are still following the main drag of the story. And the main reason for this is that if your target audience is young adult or adult, they tend to want longer storylines. And we're going to look at some of the narrative structures shortly, but I'll quickly show you here a narrative structure called Time Cave. This is what happens, for example, in a Choose Your Own Adventure book, if at the bottom of each page you're given two choices, and assuming that all of the choices lead to different pages and that there are no loops in the narrative, you would have to write over 1 million pages in order to have a read-through length of 21 pages. That is to say that the average reader would reach the end of the story after 21 pages, even though the writer had written over 1 million pages. And that's basically because mathematically, if you start with 1 page and have 2 choices each time, you end up with this. And that's probably why choose your own adventure books appealed to younger audiences who were happy to complete the story pretty quickly. They could always go back and replay the story multiple times. So most of the narrative game apps I've looked at use various ways to allow the user to make regular decisions, but without those decisions creating an unending number of new story spurs. And again, we'll look at narrative structures a bit more shortly. So one of the games that's available as a free-to-download mobile app is Wizard's Choice. And like most apps, it's free to download, but then contains what's called in-app purchases. This app is actually available both as a text adventure, where you read the story, and as an audio adventure, where the story is read out to you. This app is quite a good example of how a narrative game can be written, so that there are regular choices throughout the game, but that the game follows a very clear direction, and it's impossible to cause many dramatic spurs away from the main plotline. Similar to the Fighting Fantasy game books, you start out with certain variables set. In this case, you've got life, mana, gold, and morale. And then you get a picture, some text to read, and then you get a selection of choices that you can make. But more often than not, the choices you make don't really alter the course of the story so much as decrease or increase the variables that are at the top of the page. If you fight, you can lose life points but gain morale from winning, or extra gold from rummaging the pockets of the dead goblins, etc. If your life points reduce to 0, you die. There are some spurs off the main storyline, but you tend to get funneled back onto the same plotline after a short time. So as a writer, you would be writing a main thread, and then having various events which cause the different variables to increase or decrease. You can enter different rooms and go different directions, but eventually, assuming you survive, you would tend to find yourself still following the main drag of the story. There's another app which I believe became Time Game of the Year, and it also had BAFTA nominations, which is called 80 Days, and is based on Jules Verne's novel 80 Days Around the World. And with that app, your main choices are defined by the different cities that you can choose to travel through on your trip around the world. The aim of the game is to get around the world within 80 days, and not to run out of money en route. So yeah, at the beginning you can take possessions with you in your suitcase and sell them in cities where you get a good price. Then buy other items cheap and sell them in places where you'll get a better price. The other decisions you make are who to talk to, which subjects to discuss, mainly so you can find out about different cities and different routes that you might want to take. So the choices you make can make a big difference to whether you win or lose the game, and to which cities you visit, and what adventures you have. There are also random elements that will change with each time you play it, such as what possessions you start off with, and which ones are available to buy in different cities. This app uses fairly sophisticated visuals in that you have a 3D globe that you can spin around while planning, etc. There's one other app that I quite like, which is quite a simple app in terms of its interface. This one is called Choices That Matter, and it has 3 different stories in it. The app is, as I say, fairly simple and relies almost entirely on the storylines themselves to entertain. There are virtually no visual elements except to indicate when it's your personal digital assistant talking to you. And it also has a few very basic audio elements. It has some sort of music in the background and some notification sounds when your in-game digital assistant talks to you. In one of the stories, When the Sun Went Out, you follow a character who is travelling across the world investigating what is causing the sun to keep disappearing from the sky, which sounds a bit daft, but it's actually quite a well-told story. Professors and people investigating the causes keep disappearing or being murdered, and there seems to be a strange cult linked to it. And again, there are frequent choices to be made, but many of the choices have very little immediate effect on the direction of the story. Other choices allow you to choose whether to visit one building or another, and depending which you visit first, you may miss some of the action that happens at a different place, arriving there a few minutes after the person you were visiting has been murdered or something like that. So it does affect the story, certainly in terms of short-term events, but you are still heading in roughly the same direction in terms of the overall plot. It's not like the old school text adventures on the computer in the 80s where it was map-based and you could decide completely which direction to go to and go backwards and forwards as many times as you want. Also with this story, it seems you can't die or fail. So I think with writing these storylines, it's a balancing act between allowing the reader to feel that they can influence the story and of not allowing so much control that the writer has to write thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of narrative. In many ways, smart speakers have similar options to mobile apps, except obviously they'd be based around audio rather than text. If we made an audio adventure, it could be aimed at both platforms, so we could record all the audio and possibly use it both for a smart speaker adventure and for a mobile app adventure. So smart speakers rely on something called NLP, which stands for Natural Language Processing. And Google Assistant actions and Amazon Alexa skills are based on the user's ability to talk to the smart speaker using natural language, and the tech behind the speaker processes that language and responds appropriately. With Google Assistant, the software that's normally used to process the language is called Dialogflow, which is also owned by Google, and we'll have a look at the Dialogflow interface and how it works in a minute. There are currently various examples of interactive fiction available through Google Assistant and Alexa. And by the way, if you don't have a smart speaker, but you do have a smartphone, you can access Google Assistant and Alexa on both iPhones and Android phones. If you have an Android phone, you can access Assistant by touching and holding the home key, which is the little circle item in the middle of the toolbar that appears at the bottom of your screen. You can also download Alexa from the Google Play Store. And likewise, you can download Alexa and Google Assistant to your iPhone via Apple's App Store. If you want to try out some simple interactive fiction, you can try out Jungle Adventure on Google Assistant, which is aimed at younger children and is very short to play. Or you could try Open the Magic Door on Alexa, which is also aimed at a young age range. But it's slightly more sophisticated in terms of the fact that you can pick up keys in one room and use them in another, rather than purely choosing between choices. The other difference between Jungle Adventure and Open the Magic Door is that Jungle Adventure uses purely recorded audio. You've got an actress delivering the narrative content, whereas in Open the Magic Door the narrative is delivered by the Alexa voice using something called text-to-speech, or TTS. So the designer writes the text into something like Dialogflow and then it's automatically turned into an audio voice. And actually the opposite happens when you talk to the speaker. Google Assistant uses software to turn your spoken words into text, which can then be deciphered by Dialogflow. And this process is referred to as speech-to-text, STT. Google Assistant's web pages have articles about how to write conversational dialogue, which is probably of some interest, but it's probably a bit different from writing interactive fiction narrative and dialogue. I've got a couple of great links that I'll share, which are blogs and specific blog posts related to actually writing content for narrative fiction, but I'll talk to you about those a bit later. There are also some audio apps aimed at young adult and adult audiences. Some of these are linked to popular TV series. There's one linked to Stranger Things, another to 3%, and one linked to Lost in Space, all of which I think are Netflix produced TV series. But there's others as well, like on AirPlay, which is an Amazon skill you can download, and those are original content. Hey Google, talk to Jungle Adventure.
Getting Jungle Adventure.
Hello there, my old friend. I was just about to recount the tale of our adventure. Let's think back to many years ago, when you were my assistant on an expedition through the deepest jungles of South America in search of a lost temple. I remember it as if it were yesterday. I have some bad news. We're lost. Now, I recall from my research that the temple is located near a river, but we're running out of food, and it will be dark within a few hours. The way I see it, we have 3 options. We can scavenge for food, find shelter, or look for the river.
Try to find some shelter.
I agree. Shelter. Let's seek out a refuge in this wild, untamed land. Onward! We've been walking for hours. Hold on. I think I see a cave up ahead. That cave will surely provide us shelter from the elements. But it could be dangerous. What should we do? Go to the cave or turn back?
Go inside the cave.
Here we go, into the cave. My, it's dark in here. Wait, I think I hear something. Huh, maybe it was just me. Now I definitely heard that. Holy moly, it's a jaguar.
So this is the, in fact that's the Dialogflow. I should show you the actions on Google console. You can create a project in the actions on Google console, create a new project here, but you don't actually do much in the actions on Google or the actions console. It takes you through to Dialogflow, which is also part of the Google empire. And I'll just click onto a project that I've already been playing around with. Click on this one, Interactive Fiction 1. So basically within Dialogflow you have something that's called an intent, and each intent tries to capture what the intent of the person is. So you can think of intents as almost like a scene that comes after a choice. So if somebody says kill the monster, you would have an intent that is linked to that. The intent could be called kill the monster or whatever you want it to be called, and it would look out for the user saying kill the monster, for example. So if we create an intent here, I'll just show you what's inside. You've got obviously the intent name. We could call that attack monster. So you've got the intent name at the top. You've got something called context, events, training phrases, actions and parameters, responses, and fulfillment. But there's only a couple of 2 or 3 of these that are really important. The first one is the training phrase. So in here, this is what Dialogflow will use to train its artificial intelligence. So this is looking for what the user might say. So the user might say kill the monster, but it might also, the user might also say attack the monster or kill it or hit the monster with the sword, assuming the person has a sword. There could, and yeah, there's a lot of different ways of saying attack the monster, or attack whatever it is, or kill it, or strike it with a sword, or use the sword to attack the monster. So all the different ways you can think of that a person or a user might actually say they want to do that action, you can write all the training phrases in. And then Dialogflow will use that to try to train the artificial intelligence, not only to look for those exact phrases, but anything that means roughly the same as well. Monster. Okay, so you've got that. So that's obviously when that is, or when the Google Assistant hears those words, hopefully they will trigger this event or this intent. So when it does trigger, you can put in the text response, this is actually what Google Assistant will say back to you. Or if you've connected it for Alexa, because you can use Dialogflow with Alexa as well, this is what it will say back. So you've got here, you can just type in text, just plain text, and say you have killed the monster. Oops. You have killed the monster. Or anything else you can put in paragraphs. You could also put in, there's some certain things that you can put in, say, that will put in a larger break. So you would put extra directions within triangular brackets, or the sort of less than and larger than symbols. So you can put in break. I can't remember exactly what the format is, but it's something like break equals and the amount of time, or something like that. And you can also elongate words and do things, so you can try to get the Google Assistant to say it the way you want it said. If sometimes it sounds alright when they say it anyway, but you want it to be said in a particular way, then you can put in extra directions there. You can also put in links to audio files here as well, so you don't have to have the Google Assistant responding. You can have actors and actresses pre-recorded, and then put in the links to the audio files here so that it plays those audio files instead of using the robotic voice of Google Assistant. And you can obviously put in background sounds and things as well, so you can do everything with actors and actresses if you want. So those are the two most important ones, and the third one that's important is contexts. So you might have, for example, in an intent, it says kill the monster, but you might have, if you've got a long story, you might have 10 different monsters that all pop up in different rooms. So you might be listening for the user saying kill the monster, and obviously you don't want it to go to the wrong scene or the wrong response. So that's where you use a context. So in the scene before this one, the one that sets up there is a monster in the room, you would put an output context. So you might say monster in dining room. And you might even put scene on the end, so it's monster in dining room scene. So that would be the output context of the one before. And then obviously this one wants to know that is the scene that it's coming from, so in the input context of this one you would just write exactly the same thing. So you'd put in the dining room scene and write it exactly the same, and then this intent will only trigger this intent if the scene before was that one. And you can actually put in, I don't know if you saw, then it adds 5, so that means keep this context for five interactions. So you could have, if you pick up a sword in a scene, you could say keep that for the next 500 interactions. So that will mean for the rest of the game that person then has a sword, So this could be context of sword, and then you could be looking in other scenes to say if they have the sword and if they say they've hit the monster, then use this intent, so you hit the monster with the sword. You can also, if in a later scene you wanted them to lose the sword, you can change the output context of that particular intent when they actually lose the sword. The output context, so if you'd set up earlier has sword and you'd put in 500 so that they would have the sword indefinitely, you could then, on the output context of the scene when they lose the sword, set that context to 0. So as soon as that scene ends, that context stops being true. So has sword is no longer true, so they haven't got the sword anymore. So basically that's it. I don't know if I've explained that very well, but it's, yeah, those are the three main things. There's a few other things you can do, including the fulfillment. You can actually use some programming to put extra variables in as well if you want to, but you can make a pretty good text adventure without doing anything other than just using this interface and those three basic things. Okay, so finally we get actually onto the writing part of this, and I'm just going to give you some links mainly to, or give you some homework to read these 2 or 3 articles, because they're really useful, I think. But I'll just quickly run through what's on them now. This one I think is called heterogeneoustasks.wordpress.com, but I'll include the link below. And it goes through, it's an article on, it's called Standard Patterns in Choice-Based Games. But it goes through all the different structures that you might decide to use in choice-based games. You've got the one that we talked about earlier, Time Cave, which is the most basic of all, where at the bottom of each page you've got 2 choices, and where it expands very rapidly, so you've got loads and loads of endings. But then he talks about the various other structures you can have. The one called Gauntlet, where you've got the main thread of the story, and basically if you make the wrong choice you die very quickly, so you're running the gauntlet obviously, but that has very few pages that the writer has to write, but it's probably not an ideal structure for a lot of things either. You've got the next one, which is Branch and Bottleneck, which is again where you get quite a lot of choices. You can branch away from the main storyline, but generally you get pulled back onto it again, so you branch away and you bottleneck back onto the main storyline. But it does give the user the illusion of having, well, maybe not illusion, but they do get some choice, but at the end of the day they're still sort of pulled back onto the main drag of the story. The quest one, similar to that, you can go sort of different directions. You get different choices that make short-term differences. If you're using different variables, or what they sometimes refer to as state, obviously different directions you go, you might pick up different things, or you might learn different skills which might become important later. So yeah, the different directions you go and the different choices you make can make a difference, but you'll still end up sort of moving towards the same scenes by the end of the story. You've also got Open Map is quite similar to the old text adventure games. You can, I don't know how well you can see this on the screen, but you've got arrows going different directions, so you can move backwards and forwards as many times as you like around the board, which is a little bit like the old text adventure map-based games, where you could go south, then go back north, and keep going over the same areas. And you've got some others. You've got sorting hats, floating modules. You've got the Loop and Grow. Loop and Grow, I think, is similar to what I talked about with the old adventure games, strategy games, where you might be, an example would be where you're in charge of a country for a year, and you go round like in a loop almost. If you're successful, you keep going and you complete the year, and then by using again, state and variables. You might, on your second time through the year, you might get different options, different things opening up, more things you can do. And so that's a good article to give some ideas of different types of choose your own adventure or choose your own path structures that you could use. There is, I think he's got a link on here. Yeah, he's got the link to Emily Short's blog. Emily Short goes into a lot of technical detail on how to write things. She's works as a consultant for games companies on sort of narrative design. In fact, I just follow that quickly, and this one has a really technical sounding name: Beyond Branching Quality-Based, Salience-Based and Waypoint Narrative Structures. It's basically talking about ways that you can use, say, variables, like in computer things. You've got variables to keep track of what's going on in the story. But that's an interesting article as well, so I would suggest having a read for that. And if you're feeling particularly brave, you could have a look at Storylets, which is another article by Emily Short. I don't know if I'd recommend this one or not, actually, because I think we kind of end up being blinded by science, and I think we want to start off with doing something that's very simple sort of choice-based, with maybe just a few variables, like being able to pick things up or do things like that. I don't want everybody to look at all of this and then think, oh, this is too much, I don't want to do this, because basically at the end of the day you can make a nice narrative fiction or a piece of interactive fiction which just uses choices. But this, if you are interested, if you want to sort of look at other systems other than branching, then Storylets is like a storylet is almost like a little modular piece of writing that can be combined in different ways, so you haven't got necessarily a linear story. You can change it around, but again, I'll put the link for this one if you want to have a look at it. But there are loads of different articles that Emily Short has written, which give examples of different ways systems are used. She also looks at different writing software that's like freely available, that is designed specifically for writing interactive fiction. There's ones like Twine, Inkwriter. I'm not sure if that's still available. There's quite a few others, but she's got a whole article that goes through quite a few of those. So we can have a look at some of the decisions that we need to make as a group. And obviously this is something that we can discuss lots, but I'll just give you some ideas of some of the things that I think we're going to have to look at. Obviously we need to choose what sort of platform we're targeting, whether we're going to make something that can be used as a text adventure mobile app, or whether we want to be looking purely at audio, or whether we want to be doing both. So obviously if we made something audio, I don't know how popular they are as web apps and mobile apps, but certainly that would be great for smart speakers. I'll just look quickly at some of the pros and cons between smart speaker and mobile apps, if those are the things we're looking at. Obviously with smart speakers, one of the pros is it's quite a new area. There's probably still less competition, although I think the number of apps for smart speakers are growing massively. I think Google has invested in a lot of different companies to produce content for smart speakers. Obviously smart speakers are perfectly suited to audio, so obviously with Mick and her contacts in acting, it would be a great opportunity to use lots of talent to produce something in audio and add audio effects to it. The other great thing with the smart speaker is that it's relatively easy to build. I showed you the interface for Dialogflow and things, and hopefully I didn't make it look more complicated than it was, but it's actually fairly simple. You don't need very much programming or anything like that. Anybody can go in and build some of this stuff. It's more down to making decent content, I guess, making a good story and recording good audio, I think, is what would bring it to life. There's also, I mean, if we could make something good, then there's a possibility of getting some investment or at least some perks from Google because they are wanting people to create content. I'd say the biggest con of, if we're talking pros and cons, the biggest con of doing it for Smart Speaker is that you can get free accounts with Dialogflow and Google Console, Google Actions Console. But the free accounts, you can only have so many people access that in a day. And I think I worked out if there was about 50 interactions on a game, or if somebody went on there and had 50 interactions, you could have up to about 20 people accessing it each day. So you could do that on the free account. But obviously if you wanted to get a lot of people using it, then you'd have to start paying per interaction, in which case the only way you'd be able to do that is if you can somehow monetize it so that people are kind of paying to use the app. And that's something that I think is probably slightly more difficult to do, to monetize than maybe a mobile app. So those are the things. Yeah, I mean, I won't go into too much detail on that to start with. But on the mobile side, obviously mobile apps, you've got an established audience. It's cheap to host because once you've made that app, you can put it on the App Store, and it just sits there. And I think with the Google Play Store, as a developer, I think I just have to pay a one-off $25 fee just to be able to put apps on the App Store, and that's it. One of the problems with mobile apps is that once you put it on the App Store, it's very difficult to get people to find it, because there are millions of apps on there. But yeah, so it's cheap to host. You've got, obviously with mobile apps, you've got the option of doing it as a text adventure, or you could possibly do it as an audio adventure as well. It's obviously not as simple to build. It's a whole lot has to be done using code. So there's that. The other thing is it's probably easier to monetize. If you wanted to put an app up there, you could make the app free to download, but then they either see adverts or they could do some of the story, and then like the user can pay to open up extra parts of the story, or they could simply pay to have the story without seeing adverts. So there's pros and cons of both, but we'll discuss that I think more together via WhatsApp when we start talking about all of this. So that's one of the choices, I think, is whether to do smart speaker or mobile apps. But then obviously we need to think about all the other things, whether we want to do audio adventures or whether we want to do text and audio. Obviously what audience we're going to be looking at. Do we want to be doing something very short and simple to start with, aimed probably at children if it's something short, or it could be something aimed at adults but possibly something that could be enlarged later. We could have one chapter of something we could try producing. We can obviously look at the things like the narrative structure we've just looked at, whether you want to do something like fairly short but with lots of different paths, or whether you want to do something that's a main storyline with not so many offshoots. We can talk about all those different things. Obviously as part of the writing, whether we write it first person, second person, third person, or how we look at that side of it. And we talked about whether, because a couple of people in the group said that they had stories that they thought could be adapted. So do we look at adapting an existing story, or do we look at creating something from scratch? So all of those things we can chat about, I think. But hopefully I haven't bored you too much with all of this stuff that I've put on here. I'm hoping it's kind of interesting, and I hope it hasn't kind of made you sort of stressed, or making it look like it's more complicated than it really is. So anyway, yeah, I hope this presentation was reasonably useful, and hopefully we can start chatting about it all and what we want to do on WhatsApp. Anyway, I'll speak to you soon.